Snyder.
Chapter 14. Outbreak. Matthew Simmons, Virginia, 2018. I could never sleep more than a few hours, and even then it was rarely uninterrupted. If a bird squawked too close to me, I'd come to. If a twig snapped in my vicinity, I'd reach for my gun. And if something touched me or spooked me in a way that made me snap out of bed, chances are I'd have to stop myself before I did something I shouldn't. So over the past few days of walking through the forest and trying to sleep under the trees, I was understandably more fatigued and agitated than usual. The sun struck my eyes as it peeked its way through the morning fog and overhead leaves. As always, the first thing I did in the morning was whip my head in all directions to see if anything or anyone was around. Nothing. Nobody. Good. By my calculations, I didn't have much left to walk through the woods before I'd clear the distance between where I'd last been seen and where I intended to go. My imagination kept me plenty paranoid, thinking of all the people that might come looking for me now that I'd decided to run away. Deserting the only home I'd known, and the only career I'd loved for the past 10 years of my life. Fucked up thing was how much I missed it despite how it had ended. I reached over to my bag and pulled out my rifle, setting it down beside me to try and take away some of the homesick feelings I had. I also pulled out what little remained of a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. My rations were running low. My water was nearly gone, but I had enough money to refill as soon as I hit the next town. And depending on just how much it suited my needs, I expected to call it home for at least a little while. The wind gusted through the sturdy summer foliage, and I kept my head to the sky, leaning against a tree trunk for support. I'd spent just about every good minute of my childhood playing in the forest, and sitting against that tree, even 20 years later, the memories still seem like yesterday. Me, my brother, that crazy son of a bitch, Derek. I never met anyone like him, and I could only hope he hadn't gotten himself killed or locked away. After all, even towards the final strained years of our supposed lifelong pact and plan, Derek never wavered. Through middle school, high school, and God knows where after, he was a true believer. As I look back over the memories again, he was also the only true friend I'd ever known. Too bad trying to kill Seb all those years ago meant leaving Derek behind to sort my mess out. Wondered if he hated me now, too. I finished my breakfast and pushed myself off the ground, dusting a few leaves off my backside, and picked up my rifle to put into my bag. I paused, staring at the barrel, slid my hand down the grip. I smiled and shook my head. Of all the things I'd left behind in my life, the one thing I couldn't bring myself to part with was my rifle. Oh, that and my sidearm and pocket knife. Shit, old habits die hard, I guess. I suppose I was a true believer, too, even though over the years I'd convinced myself I wasn't. But every once in a while, I'd still have dreams about what it would be like if our childhood plan had come true. Sometimes I'd even drift off when I was awake and find myself asking questions about the hard days that I'd spent so much of my life preparing to face. Silly now that I think about it, because even after all the tours, the combat, and the missions I'd seen, I never felt like I'd gotten the chance to prove myself. Then, sure as I stirred to the sound of snapping twigs, a thought broke my composure. It occurred to me that the reason our pact fell apart and our friendship dissolved wasn't because of everything that happened between us or because of one thing that didn't. Our plan didn't work because we never got the chance to give it a try for real. I regret that more than anything. It would have worked. We were ready. It's the waiting we never trained for. Shit. I closed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. The town I'd chosen to resurface in wasn't so big that I'd get lost in it, and it wasn't so small that I'd stand out. From what the brochures had said and Google Maps had shown, it seemed like it was only halfway taken over by corporations. and the parts of the small town that had managed to survive the transition were still thriving. In my mind, that meant it had character. It also meant a chance at finding work off the books or under the table. Hell, I'd paint fences if it got me a meal and a bed. Might even try to sweet-talk somebody if there was a good bar around. I hadn't had much in the way of romance in my life, and now that I was starting over again, I couldn't help but consider the idea of settling down. That'd be nice, to have something new for a change. I hurried my steps as I approached a thinning tree line that bordered a stretch of road. Just as I thought, I was coming up on an entrance to the town. I decided to make my way out of the woods and walk along the side of the road, leaning my neck to the right to try and catch a glimpse of the tops of houses. Sure enough, just over a couple of dips and rises in the road sat the first few buildings of, and the big sign welcoming visitors to, Birchwood. Population, 15,000. Located in West Virginia, and just about the sweetest sight I'd seen in years. A square, glass-like office building stood tallest of all except for a church steeple and a couple of radio towers. Most other buildings were just a few stories tall. Couldn't spot any big shopping malls or parking lots, but there were a couple buildings that looked like arenas or warehouses. Seeing the town, I was actually excited to get in closer and explore the lay of the land. The morning fog thinned as I reached the top of the last hill, before the road dove down into the lower ground that the town had been built on. But before I could gander at my new home, a car raced past me, moving about as fast as it could go. I turned my head quick to the side, catching a glimpse of the driver's pale expression. I scowled and shook my head. His car swerved down the road, veering to the side like some drunk maniac running from the cops. Then, half a second later, I watched the damn fool spin his car off the road and crash into a ditch. I hesitated a moment, contemplating whether or not to go back and see if the man was all right. I didn't move, waiting for him to emerge from his car. Nothing. Shit. I turned around and walked towards the vehicle, hoping every step of the way that the driver would get out, be all right, and spare me the headache of having to wait for an ambulance. The man had managed to wedge the car in a ditch just before the forest, and, from the looks of it, it screwed his ride up pretty bad. I slowed my pace and adjusted my bag as I approached the driver's side door. The man sat motionless with his head drooping down, probably too drunk to keep his eyes open any longer. I reached out and knocked on his window, but he didn't move. His hair was just long enough to cover the side of his face, and I couldn't tell if his eyes were open or not. I knocked on the glass again. "You all right?" He didn't move. Fucker. I raised my head, looking around for someone I could flag down if I needed to use a phone or send for help. But as I did, I realized how light the traffic was. In fact, I couldn't see a single other car on the road. Lucky for them, I guess. This guy could have just as easily killed someone if he didn't drive himself into a ditch first. Even still, it struck me as odd that early on a Thursday morning it would be this dead on a main road to town. I looked back at the man, startled to find him staring back at me, his eyes empty and lifeless, his skin pale and expression blank. His neck twisted around until his shoulders turned towards me, and he held a hand up, reaching for me, only to hit it against the glass. He tried again and again, dropping his jaw as he let out a guttural moan that made the hairs on my back stand on end. I stood motionless, in shock, in complete and utter shock. I had to be dreaming. There's no fucking way that... I had to be dreaming. The man's hands kept bumping against the glass as he leaned towards me, his lips pressed against the window, gnawing at the glass like he didn't even understand it was there. But the window didn't fog up, not even a little bit. He smeared saliva on the glass, opening his mouth wider and keeping his eyes locked with mine. But still, no vapor, no breaths. If the window didn't fog up, it meant he wasn't breathing. If he wasn't breathing,
it meant he couldn't be alive. This man was dead. And if he was dead, it meant Derek was right. Jesus fuck, it was happening. 20 goddamn years of telling myself we were crazy, and it was actually happening. I smacked my hand to the back of my neck and let out the breath I'd been holding, shaking my head in disbelief. Fuck me, I sighed, stepping away from the car and looking back in the direction of the town. Population 15,000. I stood there for a few moments, watching the man hit his hands against the glass with increasing force. His barren, lifeless expression looked just like I thought it would. The moans he let out, dulled by the car he sat inside, sounded exactly like I expected them to. Even the rigid curls of his lips and his saliva-drenched, protruding teeth fit perfectly to the mental images I'd had of what the infected would look like. But still, something seemed like it was wrong. Something was missing. The undead were never supposed to be a pretty sight, and while the man in front of me had only just succumbed, he seemed too squeaky clean to be a ghoul. Where was the blood? There wasn't a drop of blood on the man. There wasn't a bite mark oozing or a wound gushing, nothing. This man hadn't been bitten, which meant he'd contracted the disease in some other way. He'd even had the confidence and ability to sit in a car and drive himself. And if he'd made that decision, who knows where he came from, how long he'd been driving, what he was running from, and whether or not he was even aware that something was wrong. This man was the first infected I'd come across, but that didn't mean the infection had just begun. I'd been in the woods for days. It could have started days ago. And if that were the case, it meant there would be more like him. It was happening. It was actually happening. Fuck me. Suddenly, I wasn't fighting with disbelief or the 100 different emotions shooting to the surface. Instead, I was reverting to my training in the forest. The switch that goes off inside you when you're being shot at is multi-purposed, and looking at the undead locked in the car trying to reach for me set it off just as well. Procedure called for me to kill any isolated zombies in complete silence to keep them from following me and attracting more undead. A simple logic. It would only be a matter of time until he broke through the window and made his way out of the car, because, unfortunately, the fucker hadn't been wearing his seatbelt while he was still alive. I had no choice. However, the fact that the man had no blood on him worried me. The fact that there were no other cars around did, too. I still hadn't seen the town other than the tops of buildings, and it could still be the case that the infection was contained. Maybe it hadn't spread there yet, and this man was a danger not only to me, but to them. I needed to do recon, but first, I needed to remove the known threat. I slowly reached my hand forward and gripped the door handle. I hesitated, remembering once more that he had managed to contract the disease through some other means than being bitten. And if that were the case, it could mean by simply exposing myself to him I could become infected as well. But that was never part of the plan. No one could prepare for an airborne infection. And if it had truly come to that, then I was dead either way. I popped the car door open and the man's moan amplified in volume by double. His arms pushed the door towards me and I stepped back to avoid his reach. My rifle was already out of my bag and in my hands, but I held it on both ends, ready to use it as a club. The man slowly stood up, moaning loudly and stretching his arms towards me. I took a step to the side and watched as his eyes followed me closely. His fingers twitched with anticipation as he came nearly within arm's reach of me. But just as he took the final step in my direction to grab hold of me and turn me into something like him, I moved quickly around his side and swung the butt of my gun into his temple. The man fell over from the force of the blow, but never stopped moaning. I raised the gun above my head, watching him try to return to his feet, only to bring it down across the back of his head over and over again, just like we trained to do in the forest with coconuts and hammers. His head burst open on the fourth blow, and his brain squished against the pavement. Only then did he stop moaning. Only then did he stop moving. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly.
I turned my head as a noise startled me. A car drove down the road heading towards the town. As it approached me, I was able to make out the expressions of those inside, warm-skinned, everyday people. However, as they came to notice me, rifle still in hand, speckled with the brains of the man who I'd just beaten into the pavement, I could see their expressions lose their color. The woman in the front seat turned around sharply to try and cover the eyes of her children. They sat pressed up against the window with their mouths hanging open, appalled by the sight they saw. It was clear that they hadn't encountered an infected yet, and looking at me, doing what I was doing, was the only thing they recognized to be afraid of. The car sped up and raced towards the town. I watched them go over the hill and disappear before returning my focus to the crushed skull my gun lay against. The man's brains were mush, not simply because I'd squashed them out of his head and smeared them on the road, but because the solanum that causes the infected to turn into walking dead had made them so. It makes its way through the bloodstream to the brain and turns it into an extra thick smoothie of fried wires and useless nerves. The undead can't feel any more than they can breathe. They can't think. They can't decide. All they can do is walk, eat, and moan. For whatever fucked up reason, the only thing they're interested in eating is other people. I knew exactly what the ghoul I'd killed was, despite the looks of horror I'd received from the passing car. I knew exactly what the dangers of infection were, what the social repercussions would be, and how other uninformed people would react. The only question in my mind was how far the infection spread, and how dangerous was the area I was in. I wiped the butt of my gun on the back of the dead man until it was clean. As long as I didn't have any open wounds, I could safely make contact with it, though, needless to say, I had my trepidations. I hung my gun over my shoulder this time and strung my bag around the other. But before I could decide on a direction to turn, the same car that had passed me speeding towards the town came rushing back in the other direction, the people inside even more afraid than when they'd first seen me. I watched in frustrated disbelief as they headed down the road, kicking up noise and gravel behind them, sure to lure any ghoul within earshot to follow in their direction. But what became clear to me, even more than how utterly stupid and hopeless the average person was in times like these, was what could possibly have scared the people in the car that much. I turned my focus back in the direction of the town. Protocol said to move immediately in the other direction, to head north or find a stronghold. But I just couldn't without knowing for sure. I had to see for myself. I had to know how bad it was and how far I'd have to go to find someplace else to call home. I walked hesitantly to the top of the hill that overlooked the town, ready and willing to fight again. What seemed like 100 cars were parked bumper to bumper along the road and spilling off to the sides of it. A few people tried to squeeze in between them, but from the way they were moving, I knew they weren't people anymore. Just beyond that, I spotted a large crowd of folks wandering down the streets. I looked for any banners, booths, or displays that would indicate there was a fair or a parade going on, but I couldn't see anything. The town was overrun. The infection had spread. And as I looked down at the relentless carnage and chaos that had befallen so many people, I felt a wave of despair rush over me. I'd wanted so much to forget, to start anew and rebuild. But now I'd never have the chance. 20 years ago, it would have been liberating to see what I saw that day. I would have been eager to prove myself and to beat every last ghoul into the ground. But that was 20 years ago. Now, despite the vindication of knowing I was right, I wished more than anything that I had been wrong. I returned my eyes to the few people that walked in between the cars and uncapped the scope of my rifle, raising it to my shoulder to get a better look. I was wrong. The cars weren't parked bumper to bumper. They were crashed bumper to bumper. Broken glass and bent metal littered the pavement. But what really drove home the point in my mind was the color of the hill. All across the crashed cars and the green grass were smears of blood. Across the roads,
the buildings and the people themselves were stains of flesh and gore. I lowered the sight and closed my eyes, hearing the distant screams of the few people still able to cry out for help as they ran terrified from their once friends and neighbors. But there was no saving them now. There was no hope for the weak or the ignorant. I knew this then as I always had. But something about seeing it, about being as unable to help them as they were unable to help themselves, took a toll on my conscience. My heart beat faster and my mouth dried. I could feel the familiar creep of adrenaline hit my bloodstream and my nerves tightened up. But I refused to let myself entertain the idea of being a hero. I opened my eyes, stood upright, and turned in the other direction.